So, what is the goal of philosophy? People have been asking this question for many years, and everyone often comes up with their own answer to this. See, it's such a broad, encompassing idea that it's hard to pinpoint. But one way of thinking about it is it's kind of like the history of human thought. So, it has to do with the big questions that humans have asked basically from the beginning of time. So these questions might have to do with what's our purpose? What is real? What exists? These things are kind of like metaphysical questions. Um, how do we know things? This is kind of like an epistemological question. So when we learn something, how do we know it's true? How can we trust that thing? How do we know it's reliable? How do we justify our actions or justify our values? Um, and also, along with that, is how do we think about things? Can we reason about justification, about how we know things, about what actually is? That might be the field of logic. So that's how patterns emerge in reality and how we can reason with each other and agree upon how we reason. And then there's also what we value. So how do we know what to value? Why might we value one thing over another thing? And that bleeds into domains of value, such as how should we live, what makes something true art, what makes something beautiful, um, and also how should we organize ourselves and how should we organize society. So that involves when is it appropriate to use force and things like that. So these are all very broad questions that philosophy often tries to answer. So you might argue that philosophy is kind of an outdated field. So we live in kind of a modern, postmodern age where all this scientific breakthroughs have basically allowed us to have a pretty good understanding of the world without armchair philosophy. And there's a lot of reason to believe this is kind of true for some aspects of philosophy. If we want to understand something, not only must we think about it, but we also must experience it and find a way to agree upon our experiences with other people. And that is a lot of what makes science so powerful. So, science is a system that continually develops that allows us to interact with the world and understand it. Now, if you ask even any scientist, they'll tell you that science doesn't arrive at truth. And that's not its goal. What science does is it allows us to have a model of how things work in the world. Basically, it allows us to have power over the natural world. Any model is going to be flawed. But what that model does is it allows us to predict things, it allows us to control things. So, science, the reason it has such an influence on culture is because it allows us to produce technology, it allows us to solve our problems, and it allows us to predict things. It allows us to know what the weather's going to be like tomorrow. And because it does those things, because it has provided so much usefulness, that is why we usually accept it as being trustworthy or reliable. It's because it is useful to us. It allows us to live out our values. But it doesn't necessarily produce values. That the values that we have that science allows us to use, those aren't derived through a scientific method. And it's in this area that really philosophy, I think, can thrive. So you might argue that this process of usefulness is not just applicable to the scientific method, but also how individuals come to their beliefs. So as a child, when you're developing, You might pick up beliefs from those around you that are useful. If you have a belief and you find that it's not useful, you might drop that belief, or you might change that belief. And that seems to be, from our understanding of developmental psychology, how people acquire values and beliefs throughout their life. They they create these beliefs, they create these values, and then they test them against experience. Do they work for you? Do they allow you to act in the world? Do they allow you to interact the way that you want to? Do they work in your value system? Or do they work in your belief system? If they do not, if they don't have a payoff for you, if they don't solve your problems, you're probably not going to keep them. So there is if we assume that humans are natural beings, they're natural creatures that have evolved based on scientific theories, then this kind of makes sense. The reasons we believe things, the reason we value things, is because we've acquired them through a natural process. We are, in some ways, animals that are trained on the simple level all the way up to high complex levels about how to interact with the world. And those ways of interacting with the world that work for us are kept. Those that don't are left behind. So this is kind of a central part of pragmatic thinking, such as pragmatic thinkers such as Peirce, um, William James, and John Dewey. So you might think that our understanding of the world, if it is based on what's useful to us, we have to have a better understanding of our beliefs and values. And it's really that value structure that's most important for a field such as philosophy. And how do people acquire those beliefs and values? Oftentimes, they acquire it from their parents, or they acquire it from those around them. There's just transmission all the time of ideas that you get from the news or from media or from people around you, and you just naturally pick them up. Some of them you'll lose because they're not useful to you. Some of them might be harmful, but you just don't let them go. So there's seems to be some ideas that are more corrosive to your life and some ideas that serve your life. And really, this might be the core of how modern philosophy is going to be oriented, because we need to understand how beliefs and values can serve life and how those beliefs and values can take away from life. Whether or not those beliefs are 100% true, we will never probably know, because none of us have complete omniscience. No one has a completely objective worldview. But we do know our problems, and we can get an understanding of how our beliefs and values can solve those problems. And this is kind of what the core of philosophy was back in ancient Greece. So you have philosophers such as Socrates, who would ask people to question their beliefs and values. And his purpose was to allow them to live a better life. So philosophy is really the human reflection and the human discussion about what do we believe and what do we value and why might we do it like that. And so if we want to know what beliefs and values we should hold, we have to have some kind of idea, some kind of ideal maybe, of what would a good life be like. And that's really what Plato and a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers focused on. Like, what is the good? What is the good life, and how do we achieve it? If we understand what our vision of a good life is, we might understand how we get there, or what kind of beliefs might be useful to us to get there. And the assumption that there's a good life led to a problem. The problem is there's more than just one good life. There's not a clear objective way that we know that there's one good life. There is people that come from different cultures. There's people with different dispositions. People come from different times with different technology, and there's different histories and political structures, different economic structures. All these things influence our lives. So the problems that we have are going to be different. So the way we organize our life is going to be different. Even within the same cultures and same societies, perhaps we want different things, or we see a good life as being different than another person. So it's not clear that a good life is going to be one linear path. It might look more like a tree with a broad variety and diversity of ideas about what a good life is. So that makes it hard oftentimes to understand how to help yourself, how to grow, because you see infinite possibilities. But understanding why people choose the path they do and what kind of problems certain lifestyles and philosophies solve over others might help you finding your own path and finding what a good life is for you. So, really, my purpose in this series is to kind of explore what people think of as a good life. How do people create good lives for themselves? So we'll explore philosophies and lifestyles, religions and subcultures, and really try to extrapolate what we can learn from them. We're not trying to find a single good life, but we're trying to find why people live the good lives they do, or what makes it a good life or a bad life. And we'll try to understand what kind of problems these philosophies or lifestyles can solve and what kind of problems they might cause. That way, you can kind of navigate for yourself what creative lifestyle could you create? What kind of problems do you have, and how much you solve those problems? Or what kind of problems do you want to avoid, and how much you avoid those? So I'm looking forward to exploring different cultures and lifestyles with you, and I think this will be fun.